Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Varada Kolhatkar, and I'm your host for this meeting. Now, this talk is organized by Language Sciences Institute, which is located at the University of British Columbia, Point Grey campus. And I would like to acknowledge that this campus is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm calling in from my home, which is also located on this unceded land. And I'm very grateful to be here. If you want to find out whose traditional territory you are on, you can visit native-land.ca. Now let's talk about some housekeeping things. So for accessibility reasons, I'm going to describe my appearance on Zoom. I'm a woman with dark brown hair and dark brown eyes. I'm wearing some kind of purple with black sweater, and behind me is a white wall. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is safe learning space. We have sent around the respectful space statement and posted it in the chat. Is it already there? Yes, I think it's there. And thank you for your help in making this a safe learning space. Next thing I want to talk about is recording. So we will be recording this event, and we ask that you do not record it yourself. If you would prefer not to be recorded, please turn off your video and microphone and type your questions into the chat or the Google Doc I'm going to share in the chat shortly. Now, for your questions, we have created a Google document, and I'm posting it in the chat right now. Oh, I think it's already there, probably. Let me just do it again. Yeah, so this is the Google Doc. And we ask that if you have any questions during the talk, write down these questions in this document. And if you like a question asked by someone else, you can either indicate that by writing your name or adding +1 in front of that question. Finally, as I mentioned before, this event is hosted by the Language Sciences Institute, which aims to connect scholars, teachers, and researchers working in all areas of language sciences to create collaborations that produce and support innovative research. Now, next, I'll introduce myself and our amazing speaker, Saif. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My name is Varada Kolhatkar. I'm an assistant professor of teaching in the Department of Computer Science here at UBC. And I primarily teach machine learning and natural language processing related courses to Master of Data Science students here at UBC. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Saif M. Mohammad. Saif is a senior research scientist at the National Research Council, Canada. He received his PhD in computer science from the University of Toronto. Before joining NRC, he was a research associate at the Institute of Advanced Computer Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. His research interests are in natural language processing, especially lexical semantics, emotion and language, computational creativity, AI ethics, computational social science, and information visualization. His word emotion resources, such as the NRC Emotion Lexicon, are widely used in analyzing affect in text. And a fun fact is that Saif and we never overlapped with each other, but we had the same master's and PhD advisors. And I think one of our advisors is here, Ted. I think Ted is, I saw Ted somewhere. Okay, so today Saif is going to tell us about ethics sheets for AI tasks. Now the actual talk is going to be about 45 minutes, and there is going to be about 30 minutes of Q&A period and discussion after the talk. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions during the talk, you can write them down in the Google document shared in the Zoom chat. You will also find resources such as link to the slides and relevant paper associated with this talk and his blog post related to this topic in that Google document. Okay, so over to you, Saif.
Thank you, Varada. Before I start, though, somebody just mentioned they cannot edit the Google Doc, so I'll just take a look at that.
Oh, thank you. I'll take care of that.
Share screen. All right. First of all, thank you so much, Varada, for the very kind introduction. Thank you to Language Sciences at UBC for extending this invitation. It is such an honor and pleasure to be here and present some ideas with you and interact with you. I see a bunch of familiar faces already on the chat. So great to see you, and lots of other people that I do not know, but I'm really excited to be here because I was looking at some of the language sciences group, and you do amazing work in a huge variety of areas related to language. So it's great to be here. All right, so the title of my talk today is Ethics Sheets for AI Tasks and a Case Study on Automatic Emotion Recognition. However, before I get into this, let's make sure I can go forward. Let me first spend a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so, giving a brief overview of my research interest over the last few years, and that's somewhat tied to the main talk as well. Oops, for some reason the arrow key is not working. Yeah, so a lot of my work has been on emotions, and emotions are pretty cool because they determine human experience, they condition our actions, they're central in organizing meaning. And so for me, for over 10 years now, I've been looking at sort of the intersection of emotions and language, and what can we learn from that. And sometimes I use Nemo the fish as a metaphor for emotions because when you try and capture what is emotions, the definition and things like that, it can be a fairly slippery concept. The other thing I've realized that as you work with emotions is that it's hard not to interact with certain other phenomena like creativity and also fairness. So you'll see some of those things coming up in parts of my work. Now, people have been studying emotions for thousands of years, I'm sure, including somebody like Charles Darwin, who had this really cool book called The Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals. I think it came out about 10 years after the origin of species. And he was very keen in trying to bolster his theory of evolution with any evidence that he can provide. And one of the key things was this idea of universality of expression of emotions in animals and people. This sort of universality sort of was picked up, and galvanized as a thought by people like Paul Ekman in, I think, the 1960s or so, which later developed into this idea of the basic emotion theory, where the idea is that some categorical emotions like joy, sadness, fear, etc., are more basic, more universal, more important than some other emotions. But of course, you have different psychologists and they come up with different sets of basic emotions. So there are a bunch of theories like that there. However, I want to note that some of the important tenets of basic emotion theory stand discredited. Some, like this sort of one-to-one mapping between facial expressions and emotions, is almost discredited or at best controversial. Nonetheless, the idea of thinking about working with categorical emotions like joy, sadness, fear does make a lot of sense because when we talk about emotions, we use these terms to refer to them. However, if you really want to look at some interesting new theories about emotions, I would firmly recommend you to look at the theory of constructed emotion by Dr. Lisa Barrett. Another influential idea in sort of the modeling of emotions has come from people like Charles Osgood and Russell and colleagues, where the idea is that you've got three important dimensions of connotative meaning: valence, arousal, and dominance, that that are the most important or most primitive in terms of what is encapsulated in emotions. Valence is something that we are fairly well familiar with, especially in NLP. It's the positive, negative, or pleasure, displeasure dimension. Arousal is the active, sluggish dimension. Dominance is the powerful, weak, or in control of a situation or not in control of a situation dimension. So when we compare the meanings of two words, we can compare their VAD scores. For example, we can say, for example, that banquet indicates more positiveness than funeral. Nervous indicates more arousal than lazy. Queen indicates more dominance than delicate, and so on. So over the years, I've been fortunate to be able to work with many of these sort of models of emotions. And some of the things that we've done a fair amount is creating large lexicons of both categorical emotions and for valence, arousal, and dominance. And so by lexicons, I just mean lists of words with associated scores for joy, sadness, fear, or associated scores for valence, arousal, and dominance. And we've done that both through manual annotation and also automatically using corpus-based methods. But it's the manual annotations that have been, in some sense, much more influential over the years from what I've seen. And one of the reasons is that we for the first time created these really large, in the order of tens of thousands of terms, these lexicons. And we, as far as possible, we go for comparative annotations, like which is more positive, which is giving more anger, as opposed to Likert scales, and avoid a whole bunch of biases. So if you're interested in any of these lexicons, we have the valence, arousal, dominance lexicon, 20,000 English words. We have the NRC emotion lexicon, which was created way back in 2010. It has about 14,000 words associated with 8 emotions and positive, negative sentiment. We have the emotion intensity lexicon, which gives sort of an intensity score for these words. And we also have a word color association lexicon. So early on, when I first created the NRC emotion lexicon in 2010, I thought one of the ways we could showcase its power was by looking at stories and looking at, for example, this sort of Kurt Vonnegut inspired idea of, can we track emotions in stories? Can we track the emotions of characters? Are there certain canonical shapes here? Can we just track the distribution of emotion words in the stories? And so I had a workshop paper way back in 2011, tracking some of these sort of emotions in novels. And it was pretty cool to see how it got a lot of uptake, and there's a lot of follow-up work on this, including looking at canonical shapes of emotions and things like that. One interesting work that I would point out is this sort of collaboration with Hannah Davis from NYU. She was an NYU art student at the time. And her idea was that, I like these emotion curves that you've got for the novels, but can we take these emotion curves and generate music that captures, in some sense, the essence of these emotions in these novels? I thought it was, it seems intriguing, but pretty hard, a little crazy. But Hannah did a fantastic job. I think in about 2014, we released this system called Transpose. It automatically generates 3 simultaneous piano melodies pertaining to the dominant emotions as captured by the NRC emotion lexicon. And I can play you some of the quicks very briefly here. This is Peter Pan. I'll clip it in the interest of time. Let me play some Heart of Darkness, decidedly darker novel. So I'll cut it off here, but the clips are available online if you're interested. When we put out these clips in 2014, shortly after the conference, it got a lot of press attention worldwide. That was great to see, lots of interest early on then. And actually, a couple of years later, Hannah was invited by this group in Europe to generate some of the music from Transpose. And there was a sort of a live orchestra that played this music in the Louvre Museum itself, which I thought was pretty cool. So moving on a little further in that direction of looking at novels and emotions there, I just want to give a sort of quick heads up about this very recent work that I published just a few months back with the psychology student Will Hipson. And the idea here was looking at emotion dynamics, especially in fictional characters. Emotion dynamics is this idea in psychology to study the change in emotion state with time. And so usually there they have a lot of self-reported information. So people constantly telling from their phone or some app, this is how I feel at this time and so on. And you need to get this longitudinal data to sort of study what are the patterns of emotions in different people, because different people have different sort of patterns associated with them. So of course, another window into emotions is through our words. And so for example, if we are happier, we are more likely to utter happiness associated words and so on. And so what Will and I worked on was to sort of transfer this idea of emotion dynamics to utterances and study patterns of emotion word usage in people and how it is different amongst different people. And we're calling this utterance emotion dynamics. We've also worked on a bunch of shared tasks, like especially in semi-val. I'm a big fan of semi-val and the shared task over there. In 2013-14, we took part in some sort of shared task on sentiment analysis and tweets. We did very well, much thanks to my collaborators, Svetlana and Shaudan. Since then, we've been more interested in organizing shared tasks and diversifying the kinds of tasks that we see in with regard to emotions and sentiment. So in 2016, we had a task on detecting stance. And 2017, 2018, we had sort of shared task on emotion intensity. Especially this one on 2018, task 1, affect in tweets, had a whole variety of emotion-related tasks, especially emotion intensity regression, ordinal classification, multi-label classification. It included multiple emotion dimensions, joy, sadness, fear, valence, so on. And we had data sets in English, Arabic, and Spanish. It had about 75 streams, which was the record for semi-val, which is really nice. But notably, it also included a separate evaluation component for bias towards race and gender as well. So we were looking at things like, do automatic systems consistently or systematically give more or less emotion scores when there are mentions of certain race or gender in the text. So that's sort of a quick whirlwind overview of some of my emotion work. And my work, I think I'll... Sorry, was there a question? Okay. Okay, so I continue to be very excited about emotions and language, but today I want to talk about this specific work, ethics sheets for AI tasks, and I'll sort of give an example of this thing by looking at emotion recognition, which is in some sense an area of interest for me. All right, so this talk is going to have, broadly speaking, 3 parts, right? So first I'll make the case for documenting ethics consideration at the level of AI tasks. I'll present a proposal for a new form of such an effort. I'll call this ethics sheets for AI tasks. And I'll present an example of creating an ethics sheet for automatic emotion recognition. And of course, we'll have some sort of discussion in FAQ as well. So the target audience for this talk is, primarily AI, ML, NLP researchers and developers, educators, but in general, all stakeholders for AI applications. I have a paper out on archive in case you're interested in looking at that, and your feedback is very much welcome. This is a somewhat new proposal and it can benefit from ideas from various people. All right, so I want to start off this talk by saying how good design helps everyone. And you may have seen this article, Why Designing for Accessibility Helps Everyone by Daniel Abrahams, which talks about how designing for accessibility helps not just people who are disabled, but really everybody and the whole society at large. And so I want us to keep in mind that we are not trying to design things for particular groups, but whatever we want to do good design that helps everyone. In this context, it must be noted that as NLP and ML systems have become more ubiquitous, their broad societal impacts are receiving more scrutiny than ever before, and that is a good thing, because if you are impacting lives of a billion people, billions of people, then we need to hold things to a higher standard. But one of the things we are noticing from this sort of scrutiny is that technology is often at odds with the very people it is meant to help, and often more adverse outcomes are seen for those that are already marginalized. And that leads to important questions for us, even as researchers. What part do we play in this? What are the hidden assumptions in our research? What are the unsaid implications of our choices? And are we really perpetuating and amplifying inequities, or are we striking at the barriers to opportunity? Of course, I think you will agree that the answers are often complex and multifaceted, but we are seeing, because often nobody gets in here saying that, let's create a system that will cause harm and things like that, right? We all want to build systems that help people. But we do see a whole bunch of real world systems going wrong. And I'll not dwell on this. I'm sure you're well aware of many of these systems, like a racist chatbot, or a recruiting system biased against women, or face recognition systems that work well for white faces, but are particularly bad for dark-skinned women, and so on. The interesting point I want to point out is that this is not only an issue for systems that are being deployed commercially, but we also see this is also an issue for the research that we are doing. And in fact, we are seeing a growing amount of criticism of published research, which has in some sense nothing to do with sort of deployed system, but just the research itself is being criticized for things like physiognomy, racism, bias, discrimination, perpetuating stereotypes, causing harm, ignoring indigenous worldviews, and more. If you're interested, I would point to these particular articles by Arcus, Mitchell, and Todorov, as well as Angweso Jr. These are really good sort of articulations of some of these issues. There has also been criticism of a sort of thoughtlessness in machine learning. For example, when we are building systems, are we really thinking whether automating this particular task this particular way is going to help people, or are we just sort of following on blindly without going deep into thinking, is this rather this is just going to help people who already have advantage? There is also criticism for a sort of seemingly callous disregard for the variability and complexity of human behavior. And this is very important too, because human behavior is messy, it's complex, it's inherently complicated, and we cannot predict things accurately all the time. While on the other hand, there's a tension with these sort of machines that like to pick out what are the patterns of commonality and then make sort of act on this sort of commonality and ignore the variability largely. So these issues have been there, but one might ask, so what have we been doing, especially in the last few years, to try and address some of these issues being raised by people? And there have been some good innovations. So for example, for individual data sets, we see things like it's recommended to create data sheets that list key details about the data sets, such as composition and intended use. For individual systems, we have things like model cards, to list, model performance in various contexts and, for various demographic groups and intended use again. For individual papers, we are starting to see a lot of innovation in terms of we should write ethics statements, impact statements, ethic reviews are happening for various conferences. And this is all fantastic. And I especially think data sheets and model cards are pivotal inventions that will serve our community very well. However, I should also point out that they are not like this sort of one silver bullet that will solve everything, right? So there are some inherent limitations, especially because of their scope. For example, conflict of interest of authors. There are strong incentives for an author to present their work in their best light. For community buy-in of their work, for paper acceptance, and so on. There's a tendency to produce boilerplate text that can lose meaning after a while. And the scope is limited to individual pieces of work. There is a need for engagement at a level beyond individual papers and beyond, sort of add-on documents to individual papers and things like that. And the key point is that ethics considerations apply not just at the level of data sets and models, but also at the level of, whole areas of work or for whole tasks. So, and this is not completely new, right? It's not like we've not been looking at ethics at all for a long time. There's plenty of good work out there for many years. So there's papers looking at specific areas of research, and my own journey in this sense, for example, started with this sort of work where I was like, oh, I've been creating a bunch of these lexicons, like I talked to you about, but what are some of the possible societal implications of these lexicons, especially the negative ones, and especially what are some of the considerations that we need to take in how we use these lexicons so that we mitigate those harms? And how do we communicate to people what are the limitations of the lexicon so that when they use it, they make the best or appropriate use of the lexicon? So that ended up with this sort of a little paper on listing some of these ideas. But there are lots of other papers people have done, like what are the ethical implications of using facial recognition technology in healthcare? Or, you must have seen this dangers of stochastic parrots, the issues with large language models. Really wonderful paper by Stephen Bird on decolonizing speech and language technology, especially when you're working with indigenous languages. So there's plenty of good work there looking at areas of work. In this talk, though, I want to focus specifically on ethical considerations that apply at the level of AI tasks. And an AI task, I'm sort of defining very colloquially some tasks that we may want to automate using AI techniques. An AI system is simply a model that is built to do the task. And the reason tasks become particularly important in NLP ML, I think, is that they are, in the sense that in machine learning, tasks are used as sort of a test bed to evaluate the methods. But when you look at natural language processing, computer vision, human-computer interaction, tasks are a strong sort of central piece of the work that we do. It is used as a way to organize the research, and you have subfields that are sort of based on these tasks even. So if we look at an example task, so let's say we want to detect personality traits from one's history of utterances, right? Even before we build a sort of AI system and look at the limitations of societal implications of the model, I think there are important ethical considerations to be discussed at the very level of the task. So we can ask questions like, what are the societal implications of automating personality trait detection? How can such a system be used or misused? What are the privacy implications of such a task? Is there enough credible scientific basis for personality trait identification, enough that we should think of attempting to automate this? Which theory of personality traits should we use for such an automation? What are the implications of whatever choice that we choose? We get data for that particular model, and then we build this model. What are the implications of choosing that particular model? Lots of questions like this are important. And I think currently in AI conferences and journals, we do not have a dedicated space to discuss such questions that are extremely important when talking about these tasks. So in addition to questions that apply to task directly, there are ethical considerations that are latent in the choices we make, that we commonly make in dataset creation, in the choices commonly made in the methods we use, and also in the evaluation. And poor choices have often manifested in harms and controversies for a number of AI tasks, right? So the crux of my motivation is this. If one wants to do work on an AI task, then right at the beginning, it will be useful to have a go-to point for a list of ethical considerations relevant to the task. Now, I know we've got these things written in various papers that spread about all over, but won't it be nice to have a single document or multiple documents that sort of synthesize, organize, and aggregate this information? But maybe you say, wait, Saif, do we really need ethics sheets for all AI tasks, especially for tasks other than face recognition, which seems to get a lot of controversies? And that's a good question. So let's take a look at that. Yes, face recognition has got a whole lot of controversies associated with various issues over the last few years, but there are issues with various other tasks as well. Let's take emotion recognition. A few years back, Svetlana Kirichunga and I, my colleague, we did this work on examining gender and race bias in various sentiment analysis systems, and that is an important issue that we should be careful about. And if you look at sort of this unholy combination of face recognition and emotion recognition, you see a whole number of other controversies coming up as well. Most notably, with this idea, especially I would point you again to this work by Dr. Lisa Barrett, who has shown that this sort of facial expressions are really terrible indicators of emotions of people. And so yet you have lots of companies peddling these sort of resources that tell you that, okay, we can determine the emotional state of people just by looking at people's faces. Personality trait identification, you have sort of controversies with MBTI. You don't have good test-retest reliability for that model. the claims of how such personality trait identification is discriminating against people. And these things are being widely used in industry. What about machine translation? You say it's a flag bearer of NLP technologies. You see plenty of controversies come up, and issues like how gender bias in machine translation, co-reference resolution, image generation. You have issues of deepfakes, text generations. Again, dangerous AI offers to write fake news. And really, if you think a little about many of these sort of tasks that we are used to, it's not hard to figure out how there are plenty of important ethical considerations to be had there. The overall point is that all AI tasks have their own unique set of ethical considerations. And it's not a matter of controversial or not controversial. It's a matter of, sometimes even small choices of what we can make can have, lasting and big impact on the people who use these systems. And so we should be thinking about that. So that was sort of the motivation, and I'll jump into the proposal shortly. But if there are any questions at this point, we can briefly talk about that. Okay, yeah, I see one question here. Or I see a couple of questions. I'll take this second one because it looks shorter. I can read it quickly. It's by Alex. How do you account for unconscious bias in developing the ethics sheet? Good to start a task off from the start with sheets, but what if unconscious bias doesn't allow you to create helpful, appropriate sheets? I think that's a great question, but I would sort of hold off on that until I do more of the presentation, where I talk about the ethics sheets a little more and things like that. Varada, you had some thoughts on concerns with respect to companies using aggregate information versus individual information. I think that's an important ethical consideration. I do talk about that in the specific ethics sheets for emotion recognition. But again, maybe we can hold off on that discussion until we talk more about the higher level about the ethics sheet itself. All right. So the proposal that I'm suggesting here is that we create ethics sheets for AI tasks, and ethics sheets is just a name. Pick whatever name you feel is better. I'm good with that. What I'm suggesting we do is that create carefully compiled documents that substantively engage with the ethical considerations relevant to a task, going beyond individual systems and data sets, drawing on the knowledge from a body of relevant past work and from the participation of various stakeholders. Right? And it's useful to have such a document right at the beginning when one starts to work on an existing AI task, or it is useful to conceptualize such a document and create a starting version of it, at least when one is sort of proposing a new AI task. Put simply, the document just aggregates and organizes the ethical considerations relevant for that particular task. It is not so much about telling you or people what is right and wrong. It is more about helping people decide what may be appropriate in what context. So the way I think of it is that a good ethics sheet should flesh out the assumptions that we tend to make in research, in how the task is commonly framed, in the choices often made regarding the data, method, and evaluation. It should present ethical considerations unique and especially relevant to the task. That is particularly important, of course, but it should also present nuances of how common ethical considerations, like what Varada asked in a question about aggregate level user information versus individual level user information. How does that manifest in this particular task? Is this particularly a particularly more important problem here, or it's less of an issue? Why? What are the harm mitigation strategies, and so on? Communicate societal implications to researchers, engineers, and the broader public. List common harm mitigation strategies. At the core of it, the ethics sheets are meant, I think, to encourage more thoughtfulness. Questions like, why automate this task? What is the degree to which human behavior relevant to this task is inherently ambiguous and unpredictable? What are the theoretical foundations at the heart of this task? What are the social and cultural forces at play that motivate the choices we make, in task framing, data, methodology, and evaluation? And here I would want to point out that, science is not just, a search for the truth, and it's not influenced by society. We are people living in a society, and our choices in science are influenced by society. And so it's important to think about those as well. How is the automation of the task going to impact various groups of people? How can automated systems be abused? Is the technology helping everyone or only those with power and advantage, etc.? Questions such as these can be very useful in figuring out what should be put in these ethics sheets. The target audience for an ethics sheet is essentially all stakeholders of an AI task. That includes researchers, developers, educators, media professionals, policymakers, politicians, people whose data is used to create AI systems, people on whose data AI systems are applied, society at large, and so on. I would point out here that different people might have different capabilities in terms of understanding the technical nuances of AI tasks and so on. And sometimes I actually think it makes more sense to have sort of multiple ethics sheets geared towards different target audiences. So for example, you might have a more one sort of target sheet geared towards researchers and developers. And so you present information in a way that is more suitable for them. And you also might get into more technical details. While on the other hand, you also want to create an ethics sheet that is more open-ended, without jargon, for society at large, which has minimal jargon, and which takes into account what is impacting them the most, what do they care about most, and presents the relevant considerations for them. I also want to point out that I'm not suggesting that we have single authoritative sheets for a given task. No single person, group, or institution can claim to speak for the whole community doing work in a particular area or AI task. Ethics sheets can be created in multiple ways. For example, you can have developments by small teams, and as Alex said in the question, though small teams can have may have more of these sort of biases, they might miss important perspectives. But I also think small teams are very important in providing important perspectives that sometimes big teams do not provide. So the other way to do this sort of is through large community efforts, maybe through workshops and conferences. But one of the issues there is that you have severe logistical and management challenges. How do you incorporate views from a large community, sometimes who might not agree on some number of things? And also, there can be a tendency when you have, when you create this sort of sheet that you want to say speaks for this whole large community, there might be a tendency to put up only non-controversial ideas that do not threaten existing power structures. And so I actually think the answer is more in the shape of multitude of ethics sheets by different teams and approaches for the same or overlapping tasks, which can reflect multiple perspectives, viewpoints, and what is considered important to different groups of people at different times. And this sort of answered sort of Alex's question as well. What if you have unconscious biases? Yes, that's why we need multiple perspectives and multiple ethics sheets, so that I think that is the best hope of getting beyond this sort of unconscious biases. I also want to point out that working on ethics considerations is a perpetual task. This is, your list of ethical considerations is not a static list. It needs to be continuously or periodically revisited and updated, can be developed iteratively. I wouldn't put the pressure on people to say, oh, when I first create one, it has to be super comprehensive and have everything. I would say start with something, develop it iteratively, can develop organically. It's not a silver bullet, but rather just another tool in our armament for responsible research. The goal here is to raise awareness of the ethical consideration. The goal here is not to provide a list of easy solutions that sort of solve ethics. And in any case, these are different, these are difficult issues and require, more out of the box, more careful thinking in some sense, and there will always be issues. One might ask, okay, what should we include in ethics sheets? What are its components? And from the limited work that I've done with sort of trying out this idea, I found sections like these to be very useful. It's good to have a preface sort of section where we talk about why and how the sheet came to be written. It also sort of tells people, situates the work, tells who's written it. And so, there might be certain biases associated with that. What was the process? Who worked on it? What are the challenges faced? What are the changes made if this is a revision, version number, date published, contact information, invite people to, present ideas and even, ideas that you might not agree, I think it's good to invite those because you want to include these sort of different viewpoints in your ethics sheets as well. It's good to have an introduction, of course. I think, I mean, this introduction may be a little tricky or, not so much the norm. Sometimes we see work which directly jumps into these sort of ethical considerations, but I think the introduction is important where we take a moment to define the task, define the terminology, define the scope of what this ethics sheet is about, and talk about how this task is often manifested in, AI systems around. So I think this sort of helps people sort of situate what the ethical considerations come after that. It's also really good, I think, to talk about the motivations and benefits of this AI task, list the motivations, list the research interests, list the commercial motivations, because on the one hand, we want to talk about how there's a sort of balance between various things that we can get, but there can also be problems and harms that can come out of automating such tasks. Also, again, like many things in an ethics sheets, a listing of these motivations and benefits allows stakeholders to challenge your assumptions and say that, hey, maybe that is not an advantage for us. Maybe that's an advantage to some people, but for a lot of people, this is not a good thing. Of course, I think we have to have this ethical consideration section, and that is the star of the show for this ethics sheets. This is where you would list, aggregate, and organize the various ethical considerations. When I did this, I tried to create a sort of bulleted list. I didn't want large run-on sentences and paragraphs. I wanted to have sort of clear bullet points and bullet headings so that it acts as a reference. People interested in looking at particular ethical considerations can jump straight to this and consume a minute or 2 minutes of information there. It will have the jumping off points to relevant literature that people can explore in more detail if they want to. And of course, by all means, different tasks are different, and feel free to add other sections as needed. So that was the task. That was sort of the proposal. I'll sort of briefly talk about the this sort of example ethics sheet as well on automatic emotion recognition, but maybe it's a good time to take some questions. I see one question here at least. So there's a question by Jim. From your experience, what forms of governance would be needed to resolve issues raised? For example, multiple ethics sheets, bluntly, who decides on close-run issues? I'm not sure I understand what close-run issues are. This is an important question. Thank you also for pointing out that this is an excellent grounding and basis for considering ethical considerations for AI tasks. So to answer your question, what you are talking about is in some sense down the road from what, or at least beyond the scope of immediately what this work is focusing on. A lot of this work is motivated by the idea is how can we, the community working on AI research, what can we do to do more responsible research? And so I was thinking these are ideas that can help us, think more about these things and do a better job if possible. The governance and the sort of legislation is a little more tricky. There are other issues involved, like if you submit a paper to a conference or a journal, who decides what is ethical or not? Should we reject this paper based on ethical grounds or not? These are complicated issues, and my talk is not really covering those issues. I'm happy to talk more about it later at the end, though, if needed. And there are also issues about governance in the sense of various countries are bringing in legislation regarding how the ethics of AI systems, and that is another completely different sort of ball game. Here, what I'm talking about is what can we do, from the bottom up to think more about these issues. Thank you, Jim. All right, some more questions being added, but maybe I'll move on and we'll get to more questions in a bit. So I've been working, as I said, at the intersection of emotions and language, and I find that area to be very interesting. But of course, even this area is not, not without controversies. And if you've been following the news, there are a whole bunch of controversies, like right from privacy issues to, as I mentioned, the facial recognition issue, how it's not reliable to monitoring of subpopulations, vulnerable subpopulations in groups with untested emotion recognition technologies. There are all kinds of controversies there. But as I said, this is not just about controversies or big, egregious ethical missteps. Ethics considerations apply in small and big levels, and they're all important. So I really created this ethics sheet sort of as a means of organizing my own thoughts on what are the ethical considerations when working with emotion recognition or affective computing in general. And even right at the top, is it even ethical to do automatic emotion recognition? Can we really detect what is going on in people's heads? And what are the situations? How can we frame the task such that it is more appropriate to frame that way? And how should we not frame the task, and so on? So for me, it was inherently sort of selfish for my own sake that I started this work, and I was like, let's put down some list of these things. And it was, again, very bottom up. My goal was to create these ethical considerations individually. And then as I worked on it over time, it also helped me to go higher up and think about some of the bigger questions like what I just discussed. Although, I mean, I'm not saying I have answers to those bigger questions in any way. But I also want to point out that this idea of ethics sheets for AI tasks didn't come first. I first started off with thinking that, hey, it makes sense. I've been working on emotion recognition for a while. It makes sense for me to think about the ethical considerations that apply to this task as a whole. And so let's start doing this work. And so that's when I created that. And then it was like, hey, this will be useful to others as well. And hey, this will be useful for not just this AI task, but for various other AI tasks as well. So I presented you the information in sort of the reverse chronological order there. So the full ethics sheet is fairly long. It's available as a Medium post on the web. You're welcome to check it out. As I said, it has about 50 ethical considerations. I found it useful to group them around task, data, method. I've got these sections at the bottom here: task, data, method, impact and evaluation, and privacy and social groups. So I've got these various considerations grouped under this. I found this sort of grouping to be especially useful when we are trying to communicate to developers and researchers of emotion recognition. However, as I said, if you want to create an ethics sheet for the lay public, society at large, how their data is being, data might be, how emotion recognition on them might cause them harms, you might want to choose to reorganize how you present the information. However, the focus is squarely on the people. How is this technology impacting people, and who is it impacting worse, and when is it impacting worse, and things like that. So I also created this sort of quick summary card for things that is available on the website. So I will not go through the whole sheet, of course, here because of the limited time. I just want to sort of give you sort of a quick overview. Right at the top, again, I sort of give a summary for each of these sections that I talked about. So in task design, I have a summary, and I also list in this case, the 10 ethical considerations I talk within it. They're also further grouped into like this theoretical foundations and implications of automation, higher level categories. So, and I think task design is a particularly important criteria that applies to all tasks, whichever task you think. I think there are important questions to think about, but in this particular case, I was thinking about what are the task framing choices in emotion recognition? For example, are you framing it as detecting one's true emotions, the private mental state? Are you framing this as perceived emotion? Are you talking about the emotions that somebody is trying to convey? There are a bunch of other ways in which we can talk about how you can frame this task, and they all have their implications. I talk about how whether it's even possible or ethical to determine one's internal mental state with any sort of comprehension, who is often left out when designing emotion recognition systems, which models of emotions are appropriate for a specific task or project. Remember I talked about these different emotion psychology models early on. And also, are we carelessly endorsing questionable theories, for example, about facial expression can tell you their emotions and things like that through our work. So I talk about those things here. The data section is, as one might expect, larger. We've got 13 different issues here. And the key point here is at this sort of tension between variability of human expression of emotions and also variability of how humans represent emotions in their head. I'm talking about how different people represent emotions differently. And that stands in stark contrast with how machines have this sort of normative sort of view. They want to find what is most common, and through their actions and behavior of recognizing some forms of emotion expression and not recognizing other forms, AI systems convey to the user what is normal, and therefore implicitly invalidating other forms of expression. And so what are the ethical implications of that, and how do we deal with that? I have a section on method, a bunch of things there. I'll jump on. Impact and evaluation, and I've broken this into two categories: metrics, which we do very well in general, but also stress on this idea of beyond metrics, especially on not just sort of interpretability and explainability, which is a hot topic right now, but also providing, there's some good work that points out how it's more important to allow people who are impacted by systems to have recourse. If something is wrong, how do they reach out to fix things? So that's also an important consideration. And finally, I talk about privacy and social groups, implications for these things. And these are sort of cross-cutting sort of issues that apply through all the phases, task design, data, evaluation, method, everything. And they are also particularly important for emotion recognition. And so I've sort of kept them separate here. And there are plenty of interesting points here, and I point to the really cool work various people have done. And I have sort of these jumping off points and citations that one can read for any point of interest. I would highlight this really cool work by Luciano Floridi from 2014, which is, I think it's relevant to this idea of soft biometrics and group privacy. There's this sort of, I think, a bit of a complacency in some people when they say, oh, I'm not trying to determine getting information that will identify you individually. I'm sort of getting this sort of soft biometrics, so I'm okay. But there are issues even with that. And so this particular sort of set of sentences by Luciano Floridi is really good. So I'll just read it out. There are very few Moby Dicks. Most of us are sardines. The individual sardine may believe that the encircling net is trying to catch it. It is not. It is trying to catch the whole shoal. It is therefore the shoal that needs to be protected if the sardine is to be saved. And so I think the point that Floridi is pointing out is that I think we need to think about how do we protect group privacy, or how do we protect the ethical considerations that are relevant for groups of people as well. So this experience of creating this sort of, let's call it version 0.1 of sort of a ethics sheet for emotion recognition was useful to me, simply as I sort of discussed early on, just to gather my thoughts and also to think about this more in a more in-depth way, and also to read up on all this really good work that a lot of people have been doing, and to see how that impacts emotion recognition specifically. I'm hopeful it'll be useful to others as well. And if I might be so bold, I would also suggest that creating an ethics sheet, if you go ahead and create an ethics sheet for your task, it will be useful to you as well, that experience of doing that. So that was the example. There's some more questions there, but let me run through some sort of standard FAQ questions that I have already prepared to highlight some more of these issues. So one of the questions one may ask is, should we create ethics sheets for a handful of AI tasks that are more prone to being misused, say, or for all tasks? I think this is a good question. In my humble opinion, we need to write ethics sheets for every task. This is because we need to think about ethics considerations proactively and not reactively. All AI tasks impact people in some way and thus have ethical considerations. And ethics sheets is a means for us as a collective to provide in writing what we think are the ethical considerations and the societal implications of AI tasks. Because when we are writing papers of our AI systems, we are not talking about this. We are not providing in writing what are the assumptions we have here. Having a written document, one might seem on the one hand that, oh, that's scary. Why do I want to stick my head out here? I'm not telling you to put your head out individually, but as a collective, we need to stick our head out here. Because having a written document allows the stakeholders to challenge our assumptions and conclusions. Otherwise, how will they challenge it? And giving them that ability to challenge our assumptions is important. Even for a sort of task that you might think, oh, these are, we don't need, this is minimal risk or something like that. I think, and that's okay. Create a short ethics sheets for that. But that is your that community is sort of written documents saying that we are thinking there is no harm here. So, and even to know whether there's minimum risk or not, there needs to be some amount of investigation, and the process of doing that is useful. Another question is, who should create an ethics sheets for an AI task? And there are two things going on here. Who should take a lead in developing ethics sheets, or who should take on the burden of making this happen? And a separate thing as to whose voices should be included when developing ethics sheets. For one, I think anyone or any group can take the lead. Researchers working on the task, or who are proposing a new task are well positioned to, get going on this or take the burden. But experienced researchers may have more blind spots. So we want to get people from different groups, psychology, linguistics, social sciences, to help with that. For two, voices of all stakeholders should be included, especially those impacted by the technology. Does it matter what we define as a task? I think it doesn't matter. A community interest and expertise can guide what is a task. This is similar to survey papers. And I think this idea of writing ethics sheets, for a lot of the questions, I think thinking of it as a parallel to survey papers is beneficial. People write survey papers on various things. Nobody is there legislating or defining this is what a task should be. And so I think that works fine even here. There's no objective or correct, ethics sheet or survey article. Useful to have multiple overlapping ethics sheets that cover AI tasks at various levels of specificity. One final question, why should academic researchers care about this? Isn't this the responsibility of those who deploy the systems? Okay. And in some sense, I'm hoping you are not thinking of this, but this is a good question to ask anyways, because so as I said, I made a huge case for various reasons why we should do this and how it is directly beneficial to us as well. And so it's good to do it. But of course, one obvious answer is others use, build on, make laws about what we create. Engineers, media professionals, politicians, people at large are impacted by this. It is our responsibility to describe our creations so they make informed decisions, right? So the people who are deploying systems are not building things on random. They are taking things from us researchers. Also, we are often not in positions of conflict of interest. This is really helpful. We don't lose our jobs because of raising concerns. We want to critically reflect on our own bodies of research. That's simply as good a reason as any to do this thing. There are also other relevant questions, but I'll not get into them. Sort of a cheat sheet if you want to ask some more questions, perhaps some more questions here. And the blog post lists some more of these questions as well. I guess I've gone slightly more than 45 minutes. So I'll sort of wrap up here. I'll wrap up with this sort of list of benefits of ethics sheets. It encourages more thoughtfulness. It allows us to flesh out our assumptions, presents trade-offs and relevant choices, identifies points of agreement and disagreement, moves us towards consensus and community standards, helps us better navigate research and implementation choices, has citations and pointers so that we can learn more from these about the ethical considerations, helps stakeholders challenge our assumptions. This is very important, as I said. It also helps as a means of engaging various stakeholders with each other. The ethics sheet ideally should engage the various stakeholders with each other to create this, and I think that's a good benefit of such a thing. Helps in developing better data sheets and model cards. Multiple ethics sheets reflect multiple perspectives, viewpoints, and what is considered important to different groups of people at different times. So, one might create one ethics sheet now, but 5 years down the line, we might have a different one. And again, as a record, it's useful to go back and see, oh, that's what we cared about then. And now we are caring much more about this. And finally, I would say it acts as a great introductory document for an AI task, right? So if you want to learn about a new task, I think an ethics sheet is a fantastic place to go there, get a sort of a broad overview of what the tasks are, what the benefits are, and think about all of these ethical considerations as well. So that's my talk, and I'll leave you with this invitation to think about what are the ethical considerations for your task. And I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you, Saif. Let's give him a virtual round of applause. Okay, so we have lots of time for questions. And so maybe let's start with questions in the Google Doc, and then you also feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask questions. So let's start with, so I think we are done with question number 3. So let's start with question number 4. Is that okay, Saif?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a look at it. I guess many ethical concerns have appeared in other areas like journalism and medicine. What have they done, and what can we learn or use from those experiences? I think that's a great question. I don't have a great answer. A lot of the work that I did, especially with the emotion recognition ethics sheet, pointed out, has a lot of pointers to psychology as well. Because I mean, that has a bigger bearing on emotion recognition, but depending on the different tasks, one can look at different fields and see what are the various issues. There's certainly a lot of, like I also had a pointer early on, mental health and in health applications of AI, where people are talking about various ethical considerations there. So I think that's good. I think the journalism idea is interesting as well. I can't remember which context I came across it recently. But in general, I think, yeah, looking at various fields together and seeing, we certainly don't want to reinvent the wheel and things like that. And we also want to bring ideas from various fields to deal with these issues.
Yeah, that was a great question. So I think I see Mohammad's question, and then do you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question, Mohammad?
So that's a good question, and you're asking about particular examples, but I think power structures manifest themselves in various ways all around us. I think Emily Bender was talking about how there are sort of some power structures in CS and where or NLP, where we think contributions from linguistics might be considered less important than contributions with machine learning. I mean, I worked with students that passed from various universities, and sometimes they talk about how, people on their committee talk about how is this CS? That's sort of like an existing power structure telling, no, we want to gatekeep, this is what CS is, and we don't want to bring that in. And that could be at the expense of, of marginalized groups at times. There are power structures like in companies hiring, where they want to, again, that's talked about, being an issue on Twitter, especially if you see that, where companies hire people from, who have papers already, or even universities hire grad students who already have papers in important conferences. And that gives, people who already have the advantage are now, have an additional advantage. There are all kinds of ways. So in terms of ethics sheets themselves, if that's I was talking about in terms of a community development, if the community is saying, okay, this is what emotion recognition or face recognition, this is what is okay, this is what is not okay in these contexts, then they have a vested interest, because maybe, that's what they are doing, and they might think that is okay or not okay. And so there is a sort of power structure there with who gets to shape what the community consensus is on that. And so marginalized voices might not get the attention they need when doing such things. A revolutionary change is great, but I'm also a very much bottom up, let's do this as a community in ways that we can. All I'm saying is let more people think about this, and then that increases the chance of revolutionary change. It also increases the chance of incremental change, but in the right direction. I think that's all good.
So on, but I think going forward, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on this particular question.
No, this is a great question. This is a great question. I think NLP, especially, but also ML and AI, is in some sense has been more reactionary. Things have gone really wrong, and we've decided, hey, we need to do something here, and we need to cobble together a solution, which is what has happened in the last year in NLP with various conferences, with various things. And I think they have been very useful. I think I generally support them, but I would not, I mean, if somebody says, yes, they are flawed in some aspects and they can be improved, yes, I would not disagree with that, right? Like what I said, in some sense, we want to avoid boilerplate things to be put there. There are sort of incentive issues, but I think in general, I support them overall, because I think that's sort of an ethical considerations point, because it just makes you think about it a little bit. Even if you're putting boilerplate statements, for somebody who is reading it, it is a record saying, oh yeah, even though you put a boilerplate, the community cares enough about it that it is putting boilerplate statements about it. So I think even boilerplate statements have a function in some sense, but I think a lot of people are doing more interesting work in that. And so for me, in this sense, and it is because of those things that when I was thinking about that, I was like, hey, I don't want to write about one, but what about my past work? And I don't want to write it about one research paper or like one lexicon. Let me write something about a bunch of lexicons. And then I was like, let me write something about emotion recognition in general. What are my thoughts about it? I'm not trying to tell anybody this is what it should be, but at least I should have a record of, this is what I'm thinking about this kind of thing. So I think that critical thinking is good for the community to have. So I think they're helpful. I think the community is growing. I think we will have more innovations in the future. We are learning and it will change, I think. Yeah, that's a really good question too. I think there is a track in many conferences for ethics in NLP now. I think that'll stay on. However, I do see there are two things going on. There are two kinds of papers going there. One is papers on computationally, the uncharitable way to say it would be solving ethics, or computationally trying to fix things or mitigate bias and things like that. There's a cottage industry of papers on that that's going on. But there are other papers that are non-computational that are talking about the ethical considerations that also find place in those tracks. I think that's good. I feel more protective of the non-computational work. I feel we need to have, I'll feel better if we have dedicated tracks for non-computational work in computer science, in AI and NLP, where we can talk about ethics sheets, ethics considerations, societal implications, all sorts of other things, stakeholder involvement, and what are we learning from those things. I think that is a super important part to have in computer science conference and journals, which seems mostly an afterthought now. And such non-computational work is generally harder to get in at these conferences.
Great, thank you. So I think next I see Mariana. Do you want to, and I also saw your raised hand before.
Right. So I am suggesting no regulations in deciding who gets to make ethics sheets. As I said, I believe we are still learning our way through this to figure out what we should be working on. And I see even later, I mean, there's no reason to stop anybody from creating their own ethics sheets, right? There is going to be a bit of this thing that, we would hope that if people create good ethics sheets, people create ethics sheets that are more dramatic and more impactful and more new ways of thinking than what people have done earlier, they will get more attention, and we will work on those things. And so I don't see any, I don't foresee any, I'm not suggesting any regulation on who gets to create it and that sort of thing. I think it can be done in teams or groups, like what is done for survey papers, for example, right? Who decides who writes a survey paper for a area of research, so it's not, there can be multiple survey papers for an area of research as well, and that's fine. It's their perspective. I think an important consideration is also that when you're creating these ethics sheets, you're not just collecting a bunch of information and putting them here, you're also synthesizing the information in a certain manner to present it. So there is a knowledge addition here that's happening when you do this, create these ethics sheets, just like what's happening in survey papers. And so who creates this? Sometimes different groups can create different groups that create different ethics sheets that point out, here are the things that matter to us, kind of thing, and that's a good thing. but one can also do this by community efforts, as I said, through workshops, conferences, or multiple people have said, can we create wikis to do this thing? And I think that can help in some ways, but it really, as I said, you need a synthesis, you need to present a cohesive narrative, and present various ideas there. So you can't just put up a wiki and hope that a bunch of people will paste things and you'll get something reasonable.
So I guess I'll skip myself right now, and then maybe there is a comment observation by Jim. Do you want to talk about it, Jim, or?
Thank you so much. I appreciate your comments. That's great. I fully agree with both your points about both these sort of implications of this thing. And actually, I can't believe I didn't think about you were talking about management. Yeah, I mean, I was much too focused in this from the perspective of a researcher. We want researchers to do better, but clearly, this is the thing you want companies to do with any task, right? And working at NRC, not only do we do sort of research in general, but we also have various clients that come to us for various tasks. And sometimes when they come to us with a certain task, I'm tempted to ask them, well, have you thought about the various ethical implications of this task? Has somebody done some study and you've looked at pros and cons, and because that gives me more confidence then in helping you, because I can see how this task can go wrong and be done in a poor way. And you're absolutely right that they could just, I mean, the ethics sheet is a mechanism in that sense for them to get an idea on that. And I also agree with your point how the ethics sheets can be used as a mechanism of maybe ethics washing or something, that we're like, okay, we've done something here, and but we'll go ahead and without a critical engagement and without actually taking the right steps. That can always happen. And I think one of my 50 points was to be wary about ethics washing, and I point to some work that talks about how not to fall into that trap. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. So are there any other questions? You feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. So there are also some questions in Google Doc, but they're by me and Alex. So I'm giving other people opportunity to ask questions, and we will go back to the Google Doc after that. Okay, so maybe while other people are thinking about their questions, so one question I have, Saif, is I think the problem is that, I think all of us understand that this is very important, but we are not trained to think about these issues constructively. So maybe this should kind of start at university level, that we kind of train people to think about these things effectively. And so do you have any suggestions on how we can include these ideas in NLP or ML curriculum?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't have direct suggestions as much, but I have thoughts on this thing. This is an important point that you bring up. So I could have started this work by saying, I am not an ethicist. I don't study ethics. And that is true. I work on emotions and language. I do NLP research, but I'm doing this thing as I said from the story. I started this not with AI tasks, ethics sheets for AI tasks. I started with, hey, if I'm working on this, I should think about the ethical implications of this thing, right? I think in that sense, I think we all should be thinking about this thing, even though we are not experts. We are not studying, have not studied ethics and things. I think it's our responsibility to think about that and work on this. Because sometimes I feel some people raise that as an issue as, this is not our problem. This is for somebody else to deal with, right? So I would push back on that, which obviously you are not saying. But what you're saying was led me to that thought. It's an important consideration. Now, in terms of teaching things, I think there are multiple thoughts on this. There have been various discussions. Should this be like a separate module for ethics? Should this be incorporated within the NLP thing itself? At first, a lot of people were talking about how it should be incorporated. I think there are pros and cons for both. There are a lot of people actually believe that it's better to incorporate it within your NLP class itself to let's think about the ethical considerations here, and then tie it to research that various people have been doing in psychology, social science, maybe ethics research, whatever, right? And then you think about that thing. But there's also some people who point out that, look, humanities and ethics researchers who spent their time studying ethics are now again being sidelined because you're creating your own module, you're not engaging us directly and things like that. So I think that's a valid point too, and we need to do something there. But those are just my thoughts of randomly. That is in some sense beyond what I'm talking about here, but just some thoughts that I did want to share about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So incorporating it in the courses like our regular introductory NLP ML courses. And if someone kind of wants to dig deeper, then they can take this specialized ethics module, I think. So maybe combination of both might be a good idea. Yeah.
And it does fit very naturally. I also don't, so the other point I would point out is that, I think as much as we will learn from various other groups and, fields of study, I think I'm a big supporter of that. That's great. However, I also want to point out that NLP researchers are in a unique position to shape this research and how to think about these issues. It is your technologies that are reaching billions of people out there, and they're raising new questions in different forms, in different contexts than what people have studied before. So it is not just, okay, we'll throw the ball on the other side of the wall and let them solve it. We need this sort of collaboration, and you have the opportunity to shape this research, because I think without NLP researchers, this will not go forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Or AI researchers, right?
Thank you. So Alex, you want to ask your question?
Sure, I'm happy to be, I've had one asked already, so if anybody wants to supersede me, go ahead. But I was just going to say, and I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, unfortunately, but I haven't had a chance to look at that. But Timnit Gebru was, so she said she was fired for critiquing bias built into Google's AI. So I guess I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts looking for NLP researchers to make these kinds of, like to consider these kinds of ethical considerations or start implementing them when there are these kind of real consequences in the world and maybe some resistance to them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a super important question. In this sense, I sort of use this sort of as a hidden sort of motivation for academic researchers to work a lot more on this, simply because, hey, you don't have that problem. You got tenure, or you're in a university, nobody's going to fire you for raising ethical concerns. So go ahead and do as much as you can, right? So that's what I was in some sense hinting at that issue as well. I do not work for a private company. I do not have experience to answer how to deal with this better. I think it's an important question. I think following people like Timnit Gebru and seeing what they are suggesting, Margaret Mitchell and others would be a great jumping off point to figure out how to do this. I think they do talk about it a fair bit in many of their talks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Alex. And yeah, actually, I think my other question is also kind of related to that how do you actually envision companies using these ethics sheets? Because I mean, as I understand it, it's not that companies don't understand ethical considerations. They understand it very well, but right. They just choose to do it anyway because, yeah, they want to earn lots of money. So.
Again, it's companies are not my expertise in this. I work for National Research Council Canada, which is a semi-government organization. It's not a private company by any means. And so my experience to answer that question is very limited. I was much too focused in this thing, and I think there's good reason for that for academic researchers to take on this idea of ethics sheets, because I think it works really well for them. there are some challenges for companies, but there are also opportunities, exactly like how Jim pointed out. I think it can be, I mean, he sort of presented this really good way, and it's sort of a really sort of, in some sense, an abuse of ethics sheets as well. But I think in general, I think a lot of companies can use it as a mechanism for saying, look, we are being responsible about this. We are engaging various stakeholders, and we've listed, here are the various ethical considerations that have come up with this thing. I think it's in their interest to point out that, look, there will be harms with any automated system that are out there, and which they already do to some extent, and things. But to be more concrete, to say, here is what is happening, here is the extent to which this is happening. We did our due diligence in finding this out to some extent. We didn't just rush into this without thinking about this thing. I think that's a good thing, and that needs to be commended. And that will work in their interest. People will be happier with them if they show the due diligence for this process and provide mechanisms to deal with things.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But I guess most of these ethical concerns arise with these powerful companies, right? Like Google and Facebook, and they just do things anyway. So yeah, that was my point. Okay, so are there any other questions? I think we are also out of time for questions, right, Alex? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it was a wonderful talk, Saif. I really enjoyed it, and so I'll just try to summarize it quickly. So Saif raised this very interesting proposal of ethics sheet for responsible research, and so I really like that what he says is that it's not just the responsibility of policymakers and organizations who deploy AI systems, but as researchers, we should also be thinking about it. And I think I really appreciate this intention of encouraging more thoughtfulness and mindfulness when we create new tasks or when we work on different NLP or ML tasks. So that, and if we come up with these sheets, I think it will also be helpful for policymakers to make informed decisions. And he also made it very concrete by providing this example of ethics sheet for emotion recognition. And I'm going to go to his blog and kind of, I'm going to try going through that sheet. So thank you for making it available, Saif. So yeah, so thank you very much for this excellent talk. And I think it is definitely going to start a productive discussion on this issue. And this is a really great starting point for all of us in the field. So thank you. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Varada. And feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss any of this further. My email should be findable from my website. Just Google my name and you should be able to get me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate all the questions, stimulating questions. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.